The COVID pandemic's had a devastating impact on the airline passenger industry, but has also seen airline cargo departments and freighter operators play a critical role in keeping supply chains moving. In the immediate global response to the virus, the air cargo industry helped to ensure urgent deliveries of PPE equipment for medical professionals and patients. And its speed and reliability was once again called into action to expedite the global distribution of COVID vaccines. But what's the wider impact of the pandemic on an industry which is so vital to meeting the supply and demand needs and expectations of global businesses and consumers, and which plays such an important role in the economic well-being of virtually every nation? Well, to tell us more, let's welcome Brendan Sullivan. He's Global Head of Cargo at IATA, the International Air Transport Association, which represents some 290 of the world's leading airlines, or 83% of total air traffic. Brendan started his career with Air Canada and has spent the last 14 years with IATA. In addition to being Global Head of Cargo, he's also Head of Cargo Operations and E-commerce for the association. Brendan, good morning and welcome to our virtual conference.
What can be used inside, what can be used in an aircraft, and so that has to do with protection from electromagnetic interference. And so what we did was we developed some standards on helping define the device, what kind of information we're talking about sharing, integrating that, of course, into one record in terms of the data standards, and as well as approval processes to try and streamline how the airlines go about approving these devices. Because right now it's each airline, they get one or many requests from the providers of these items, and then they have to go about approving them, and it can be quite an onerous task. So we've developed some standards to help. We can even look at pre-assessing certain information on behalf of the carriers, and then really streamlining the processes for them. Air cargo, there's this classic analogy that air cargo, nothing that moves by air cargo only moves by air. Of course, it arrives at the airport by truck, but there's always some multimodal interoperability required. And so we need to make sure that any of these standards that come out, they can operate multimodally, and we continue to do so. And then we go out, we pilot those standards, we work with the entire industry. So it's not just an airline thing. We work with the entire industry, and we bring them all together to pilot the implementation of these standards. And that is accelerated over the course of the last 18 months. Specific to the multimodal interoperability, so the COVID situation and what happened around it really kind of rapidly changed the industry, and continues to do so. There were very quick changes and then very quick changes in another direction. So we had a lot of protectionism in certain states just before the pandemic, and then all of a sudden everybody realized how important trade was, and started to look at that. We had blockages in certain transport as a result of incidents, even temporary in nature. These cause extreme shifts to air cargo. Air cargo typically transports 1% of the volume of trade, 35% of the value, but 1% of the volume. So you can imagine what a small change from another mode does in terms of shifting to air transport. But we had other shifts as well. For example, we have double-digit e-commerce growth year on year. So e-commerce is expected to be 20% of air cargo by next year. And in general, society really became very, very digital. We all got very sort of savvy with ordering things online over the course of the pandemic, either as we were forced to and obligated to shop online, but that really kind of solidified in the minds of the people. And it's just to re-highlight here some of the parties who are piloting some of our standards. You can see it's a really broad spectrum of the industry, and we've got partners on interactive cargo all the way through to more classic supply chain use cases. I mentioned a little bit at the beginning how sustainability is this becoming an ever more important part of what we do. And from the IATA perspective, ensuring that sustainability is at the center of our cargo standards and our cargo best practices is really key for us. So what that means, we have a sustainability framework, and then we go and look at our standards to make sure that they contribute positively to that. They promote these sustainable practices by the industry, so that way, partners who are implementing various standards don't have to look at it and say, okay, well, in what way does this maybe negatively impact my overall sustainability? So they can look at it and realize, no, they're more efficient, there's less waste, and also trying to encourage innovative solutions, because I think that's the key to solving some of these challenges as we move forwards. Examples there include plastics usage. We have single-use plastics throughout air cargo that is really at an extremely high level, and there's quite a number of different use cases for that. We have black shrink wrap on pallets to protect kind of the visible nature of the goods. And it's not sustainable to continue to use that, but we need to look at what is the alternative. Simply a switch to biodegradable plastics. Do those biodegradable plastics leave microplastics in the environment? Is it a shift to some other reusable type of covering? If that's the case, does it have fire retardant properties like we would like to see? Is it heavy? Is it causing extra fuel burn? So all of this needs to be analyzed, and that's something that we need to continue to have discussions on. It's not the kind of thing that is done by any one party. It's the kind of thing that is definitely worked on collaboratively. As I said, we have a framework for sustainability. One of the big important areas will be people. The diversity and inclusion piece, as well as attracting new talent, new skills, and building up the capacity of the industry is particularly important, especially in the crisis. We certainly hear of lots of issues with regard to personnel and challenges related to that during the pandemic. Examples include where there's a given location that has, normally 2, 3, 4 freighters in a week, and now all of a sudden is handling 12 a day. The ability to turn that on very quickly depends on good manpower, new skills, new ways of training, and a diverse and inclusive workforce. So all extremely important. When we look at the planet, first is sustainable aviation fuel and the decarbonization in general of flying, of aviation. As I mentioned at the beginning, our net zero by 2050 initiative. We can also look at the electrification of facilities, as well as of ground vehicles and future aircraft use as well, of course. But we also need to look at packaging waste, reverse return logistics, as well as decarbonizing logistics as a whole. We can't forget about the prosperity side, so the profits that the various industry players can actually generate, their efficiency, their resiliency, because really resiliency is what enables these partners to continue to operate sustainably in the long term. Air cargo trade and connecting trade from countries really does allow for a much more peaceful environment. We're really connecting different cultures together and so on and so forth. It helps with travel and tourism, of course, but trade actually generates more revenue for a state than travel and tourism does, or has the potential to, depending on the state. And that's what's really important then. And as I mentioned, it's not something that's done by any one person alone. So we need to look at partnerships, multi-stakeholder partnerships across the supply chain, industry engagement activities from an IATA perspective, but also each party doing so, and then sharing data, sharing best practices across the supply chain. That's how we enable sustainability across the air cargo spectrum. We have a real opportunity for air cargo to regain ground right now. And there's two things really that can be done. And most of this is to be done by the governments themselves. So of course we call on governments to do so. It's one, to ensure that borders are open to trade. Protectionism really does not help from a trade perspective. And throughout the course of the pandemic, many countries recognize that. Um, in doing so, they often set up things like we call them air bridges and that sort of thing. All very good. They really helped in the short term, but what we really need is more open and inclusive borders to ensure that trade can continue to travel, that it's not affected negatively by COVID-related restrictions or any future restrictions. We recognize that this pandemic is probably not the last pandemic. They often come in, give or take, 10-year cycles. We were on year 12 in between the last one and this one. And so we do expect that there could be another one in the future, and it will not look exactly like the last one. And as a result of that, we need to make sure that we have borders that are open to trade, that don't get locked down unnecessarily, and that allow for supply chains to continue to flow, and that trade is actually facilitated as well, right? So we really want to be able to facilitate the movement of trade between borders, and I think that's a really key component for countries, that they have good digital practices. Customs are doing the right thing in facilitating trade, and ultimately that will develop trade. So more trade will come online, and then all parties will be able to benefit, and will be able to be a much more profitable and sustainable industry as a whole. So that's really the end of my presentation. I want to thank everyone for listening. I want to thank again TAPA for inviting me to speak, and I'm open to answer any questions, of course. Thank you.
Brendan, thank you so much for that really interesting talk, and thank you to you and to everybody for the slight glitch at the beginning. Thank you all for giving us the chance to really test the system. We're just checking you on your toes with that. So Brendan, yeah, we do have a few questions that I've got for you, which have been coming in. And as you've shown, demand for cargo capacity has remained extremely high throughout the pandemic. But of course, this is partly a reflection of the drop in passenger operations and the loss of cargo capacity that they provide. For combination carriers in particular, how long do you think it might take to return to pre-COVID levels for both their passenger and cargo services?
That's a really good question, actually. So the cargo service is already exceeding in terms of demand. Now, whether that's for each individual carrier or not is a different question. But globally, the cargo portion has actually exceeded the 2019 levels in terms of demand. Did so in 2020, actually. So cargo is already kind of ahead, and we don't really see that pulling back much. Initially, at the beginning stages of the pandemic, it was a lot of PPE. Then we moved into vaccines, but now we're talking e-commerce and perishables and all these things which move around normally. The amount of PPE that we transport is coming down quite drastically. The passenger business is expected to take a little bit longer, and we have forecasts that extend this out into 2023 and 2024. So that would be kind of the full return, if I could say that. However, we recently actually had our World Cargo Symposium. We had some discussions with actual airline CEOs of mixed carriers as well, to get a sense of how this might have shifted their perceptions. And I think really more and more airline CEOs have understood the value that air cargo brings to society as a whole. And in doing so, have recognized that they need to look at it a little bit differently in their organizations, and will do so as they move forward. So I think even though it might take some time for the full passenger business to come back online, many of them who operate large domestic networks will keep focusing on their international air cargo in the interim.
And during these turbulent times, how has IATA been able to support airlines?
We did a number of things starting right at the beginning. The first thing we did was we shifted to kind of a webinar series. We really wanted to communicate and educate with the community as a whole. We released guidance material starting right at the beginning with the ability to risk assess and then operate passenger aircraft for cargo operations, including in the cabin where cargo was being loaded in the cabin. So we had guidance material on that. We had guidance material on okay, what do you do from a COVID perspective? So from a sanitization or personal protection, all of that material. We worked with ICAO to develop some of this, or with the WHO. Really just trying to make sure that the industry kept pace with the change, which was very, very rapid throughout the pandemic, and frankly continued. So it shifted more to collaborative discussions where we need to connect partners together. We worked with UNICEF and the COVAX Alliance to connect them to airlines to, really set up what was essentially the largest global logistics transportation of vaccines ever.
And obviously, the aviation industry relies on a whole series of connected stakeholders who've all suffered greatly over the past 2 years or so. How are you going to be working with airports and ground service providers to ensure that the entire industry recovers as quickly as possible to support the travel industry and global supply chains?
It's something that we do throughout each one of our initiatives, because I think you said it perfectly well. It requires the complete spectrum to recover, to restart, and rebuild in some cases. Air cargo is in a advantageous situation in that it never had a stop, and so it doesn't need to restart in the same way as other areas. But basically, we take every single one of our initiatives and we engage the entire industry on it. So when it comes to something like sustainability, we're engaging the fuel service providers, we're engaging the ground service providers, and the entire spectrum. And that's to try and increase the amount of sustainable aviation fuel that would be available to airlines to actually fly. And we do this throughout, from digitalization to more manual. Okay, what's the next best operational practice for handling certain types or certain commodities?
And we've got a few more minutes and a few questions that have come in from the audience as well. So I'll get to those in just a minute. But if you're okay, we'll just chat a little bit further.
Sure.
Alongside IATA's strong focus on safety and security, you're also driving other critical industry initiatives linked to sustainability and digitization. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
Sure. So yeah, as you mentioned, we have a very strong focus on safety and security. It's our number one priority. It's the industry's. It continues to be that way. So it's not something we take lightly. On the sustainability side, we have, as I mentioned, net zero by 2050. So that's probably the biggest one. And one of the largest components in there is our sustainable aviation fuel initiative. And really, the need there is to get access to more of it, right? More production. But we have, on top of that, carbon offsetting, so qualified carbon offsetting, and we have a program called ACE that can help there. But really trying to and on the digital side, we actually do this throughout the aviation space, but specific to cargo, I mentioned a few of them. So there's One Record and interactive cargo. Those are probably our top priorities. But we also look at how that can assist in back office functions. So accounting, we have our cargo account settlement system, and how that could benefit then from this increased data. And probably the one of the bigger pieces would be engaging with customs authorities. There are an increasing number of customs authorities who are requesting advanced cargo information, so prior to loading on an aircraft. And as that increases, we need to make sure they do that in a standardized fashion. Otherwise, there's no global scalability for these types of things. So we need to make sure that we do that as well.
Thanks, Brendan. So one of the questions that's come in from one of the delegates is, can you give us a split in percentages between cargo being transported by pure freighters and cargo in passenger aircraft bellies?
Yeah, so, and I'm going to talk in a little bit broad terms perhaps, but we used to have a relatively even split, 50-50, give or take, went up and down a little bit from year to year. But over the course of the pandemic, it shifted to just about 80% freighter or cargo aircraft operations, and then the passenger belly kind of filling up the rest of that. We're currently operating probably about 70% right now of freighter or cargo aircraft operations, 30% passenger, and it's coming back more where there's an increased amount of passenger capacity, passenger aircraft capacity, with passengers actually in it. A lot of what we're talking about were passenger aircraft being operated for cargo-only type operations.
Thank you. And another one from a delegate as well is, given the capacity and supply chain disruptions that are currently impacting air cargo, are there any specific air cargo challenges that have emerged?
There certainly are, and I think the person posing the question touched on the security challenges. A lot of what happens is that we have essentially new parties attempting to inject cargo into the air cargo supply chain. Some who are perhaps not as familiar with the practices that were already there, maybe even originating in countries that do not have good implementation of regulated agent or known consignor programs. And so that's probably the biggest challenge, is how do you integrate this kind of new cargo, new players very, very quickly, and still follow all the rules and yet still be efficient, right? Because we need to be an efficient business. Those are probably some of the specifics in terms of like getting a new player who may or may not be a regulated agent to now follow all the various air cargo rules. We all know how complex our business can be from time to time, and then needing to solve for all the inefficiencies that are there.
The questions are flooding in for you, Brandon. Can you explain, from another delegate this is now, whether the net zero by 2050 goal is an industry initiative or has it been put in place by ICAO?
So that's an industry initiative. We actually just agreed to it at our last annual general meeting. And it aligns to the Paris Accord. So this is how aviation can then contribute to the Paris Agreement. It's not to say that ICAO doesn't have any, they also have, but we recently changed. We had a different target prior to our last annual general meeting, and we recently adapted it to align to the Paris Agreement, be it a little bit more aggressive in terms of what the aviation goal should be and by when.
Thank you. Another one that's come in is, many airport handlers are facing backlogs and cargoes going missing. As air cargo picks up, can we expect backlogs to increase? And if so, what is the industry doing to prepare for these risks?
Can we expect it to increase? We can expect that the backlogs that we see now will at least continue. I think without addressing it, it could get worse, actually. Because some of this has to do with the fact that there is simply reduced throughput available, reduced capacity available at these various airports. Now, in terms of what the industry is doing, we need the industry to start talking a little bit better, and doing so now, as the peak period kind of builds. We don't anymore have just that kind of 1 week of peak. It's now a huge long period, and so really discussing the issues right now, being relatively open, because in some cases, if it's a manpower issue, that should be on the table right from the very beginning. And then there are ways that an airport community can come together. We've seen some where capacity has been offset in another location, and so on and so forth. But really looking at solving these challenges together right from the outset, so that the risk, which is there, the risk is that, of course, if there are more backlogs, there's potentially more cargo that's sitting around without being as controlled as it should be, and so that risk doesn't actually materialize into lost cargo and delayed cargo.
With regards to the pandemic, we obviously hope that all of us hope that the biggest disruption from the pandemic's now behind us. But if we were to find ourselves in a similar situation in the future, what sort of lessons do you think have been learned? What might airlines and indeed IATA do differently next time around?
So all airlines had a pandemic response on the books. I think if we look at what happened, airlines kind of took what the governments did and had to deal with it. The government response to these pandemics was not always even, not measured, and not harmonized across the board. So I think one of the things, and our CEO recently said this, is not to let the countries off too easily. There were a number of countries who implemented unnecessary restrictions, and so we should be on top of that early, and we would do so even stronger, I think, in the next round. But on the preparedness side, to really prepare for a variety of different scenarios to emerge, because that's what ended up happening, and it was a much longer demand shock than we've ever experienced before. It cut deeper into the aviation industry, and it's lasted longer than any of its predecessors. So being ready for those types of things, knowing that the next pandemic will not look like the last pandemic, of course.
Absolutely. And are there any other challenges, do you think that, and I think this will probably be the final question, are there any other challenges that we haven't touched on today that will be on the air cargo agenda over the next 2 to 3 years?
So I didn't talk about it too much, but the lithium battery challenge is huge, and needs the supply to come together. So we need to understand a little bit better what it is that's happening. That why are there these substandard devices? Why are they not being? Why are they being injected into the air cargo supply chain? So that will definitely be there. And the other will be e-commerce, which is rising at an incredible rate, and bringing with it new players to the air cargo market, new customers. Each one of the customers has a level of service they wish to inject into the air cargo supply chain, and they want to see met, and they want to see that visibility throughout the journey. And that's something really that the industry needs to cooperate on, because again, it's not something that one party does, because one party doesn't hold the end-to-end supply chain. So it's something connected parties can do together.
Fantastic. Well, Brendan, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll have to leave it there. We've thrown loads of questions at you, so thank you so much for answering all of those and for your really insightful presentation.
My pleasure.